Okay, so one of my first memories is of an experience of freedom. And that was when I was 3 years old. I was born in the 1930s. And so there was a belief at that time that children should be protected from all kinds of things like germs, vermin, insects, all the time. So I slept and was kept in a kiddie coop, as they called it. It was both K's, K for kitty, K for coop. You can Google it if you ever want to see what it looked like. It was a total enclosure. And so that's where I was confined. And I slept happily from birth in this invention. And it was a crib that had wire mesh all over it. It had a lid. I was totally enclosed. So there was no way to get out, as some children do. And I didn't know the difference, so I was happy. So I want you to picture this, that was where I was when I had this experience. And in the experience, when I was 3 years old, I was taken out, transported out of the crib and into the sky. And at that time, it was before the days of jet travel and before the days of stuff called filling up the sky, so it was beautiful. And I went on this trip, on this experience, to a place that was very beautiful. I guess you would call it an out-of-body experience. It was very beautiful and very peaceful. And at that place, I was introduced in a small house. It was not, there was no fantastic palace. There were no golden streets. It was all very simple, but it was so beautiful and peaceful. And it was a little house where I met Jesus, and I recognized him because I'd heard about him in Sunday school. And so it was just a case of where we sat down inside this house and had a conversation. And I clearly remember everything about it. And I definitely was there. It was not some dream or something like that. And I just had this friendly talk, and we talked one-on-one very enjoyably. There were no initiation ceremonies, no words to live by, no instructions. It was just a chat between friends. And so when I returned to my crib, the next morning, my mother came in and released me, as she always did. And I asked her if she would help me write down a poem that had come to my mind during this experience, which she did. And I learned in that experience that I was a free spirit, that I wasn't confined in any way to anything in life. That was what I got out of it. And I remember that feeling very clearly. So I somehow intuitively recognized that there was some sort of a guidance system built into this freedom. And it was freedom to seek and exist in an energetic atmosphere of love and connection. It was all about love and connection and peace. And so the next phase of this journey took place when my parents decided that it would be beneficial for me to be enrolled in a highly rated nursery school because I was at that time an only child. And so I remember how childish the curriculum seemed. I was about 3.5 then. I remember how childish it seemed and how boring. And I wanted to go to the library. I wanted to read books. I wanted to discuss things with my imaginary friends. I had a boy and a girl who were imaginary friends who I now believe are two of my guides. And they lived in the woods near our apartment, and they would come out and have tea parties with me and have discussions. And so I thought that was much more fruitful. But anyway, the next best thing was that my grandmother came to visit the school, and I begged her to let me come to her house every day instead of to the school. And she could teach me because she'd been a teacher. And before she married, in those days you couldn't do both. So this happened. My grandmother was very persuasive, and I was able from then on to go for about 6 months every day to her house. My father would take me there on his way to work, and until I was old enough to enter kindergarten. And so we would go to the library, we'd do all kinds of interesting things all day long, and it was just perfect for me. So meanwhile, another child entered our family, so my mother had something to keep her busy and not worry about what I was doing. And my grandmother was in charge of my education. So so I'll tell you next. Okay. So I went to a kindergarten that I liked because it was near the Cornell campus. It was near our home. And it was people that went there were sons and daughters of faculty members at Cornell. So the curriculum was very stimulating, and I liked it. My grandmother and grandfather, meanwhile, had converted their carriage house, the second floor, into a theater for me and my friends, with a dressing room and all. So my grandmother and I would go to the library, we'd get plays. My friends and I would take parts in them and memorize the scripts, and we'd produce these plays for my friends' parents. And this was the, excuse me, the kind of thing I liked to do. I organized a little neighborhood newspaper when I was 9 years old in our neighborhood. And to all outward appearances, I was normal. So everybody was glad of that. But I had no fear ever of trying new things. And I considered many things to be improvements that I would think of on existing methods. My mother often tried to put in the checks and balances to protect me and to protect everybody else. But as an example, one example though, where I learned again about freedom, I kept learning it in stages. First of all was that I had total freedom. Next was that I had to learn the checks and balances. So when I was 9 years old, I was sent to a summer play school, and I was never bored in life or at a loss for doing things. But my mother considered this to be good socialization and to be important. So I went, and it was fine. We went outdoors and played, but then we were put in a classroom where we had to take turns reading from a story that was the choice of the instructor, who was a volunteer. Excuse me. And many of the children couldn't read well, so it was just agony for them and so unfair. And I think maybe that's why I started eventually to teach children with disabilities, to make them feel like they weren't disabled. But anyway, as soon as we were let outdoors for another recess, I just walked away, and I walked about 2 miles to a friend of my mother's to visit, because I always had a good time with her. And she had a little Scotty dog, and she was very gracious. But of course, she also called my mother. So that was when I learned the next lesson about just doing what you feel is the right thing to do and trying to improve on what you have. And that was that I was severely punished when I got back home that day. And so that taught me that sometimes you have to go along to get along. And that was an important lesson. So I had to devise new ways of being free. So the next thing that came into play was I also understood from that justice can't be conquered by force or by defiance. So then I'll skip on to when I was 16 years old and a senior in high school. And we had moved to a rural town. And they told me that year, we had been there for 2 years, they told me that year, my teachers did, that I wouldn't have to do what the other students were doing, that I could devise my own curriculum and I could bring in materials that I thought would be helpful to me in this curriculum, which was wonderful. This is what I was aiming for, you see. This was the kind of freedom I wanted to have. And so I was sometimes asked to substitute for a teacher that was absent at that time. And so the message then was that freedom could occur if one is willing to create an alternative that is acceptable to the powers that be. So that was what I did. Now, what about my religious formation? Well, I studied religion all my life, and I was focused, though, on the circumstances and life of Jesus, not on any doctrine or dogma. And I couldn't believe that there was some entity watching us like a hawk and writing down the things we did that were good and the things we did were bad, so that we would have some kind of punishment now and in the future. I just couldn't go with that. And so my idea, the thing that caught me, was the Sermon on the Mount, where we were going to be not taking care of, but honoring people who weren't the number one successful, wealthy people in life, and to realize materialism for what it was. And secondly, the traveling toward Jerusalem, which I believe we all do all our life, to take a stand for justice, which is a metaphor for taking a stand for justice, regardless of the consequences. And so those were my theological concepts, and they still are. And for this reason, keeping life as simple as possible in a material sense has always been very important to me from an early age, and it still is. And my religious affiliations in recent years, well, maybe since the 60s, have been the Catholic worker movement, with its focus on sharing hospitality with others regardless of their status, ending war and ending the production of weapons of war, and viewing education as a joyful and collaborative experience where success is found rather than failure for the students. My grandmother's interpretation, though, we came to a crossroads where we parted in a way, although we were still very close, but her idea was that the path of scholastic achievement is attendance at a top-rated college or university. And since I'd been the valedictorian of my senior class of my high school, that signaled to her that I was positioned to go to Middlebury College or some other name brand college and to join a sorority. All of this has led to the work that I do now. All of the ups and downs. So I was given early admission to Middlebury, played the clarinet in the marching band at football games, and I joined a sorority, and I didn't like any of it. And the first editorial I ever wrote, that I ever published, was in the Middlebury College newspaper, advocating for the injustice of requiring all the students to attend a high Episcopal church service daily at the college chapel. Attendance was carefully monitored, and absence of any person at the service was monitored and resulted in punishment. The sorority policies were also modeled on conformity and what seemed to me to be lack of depth. In one example of an activity, we were all asked to choose the name of a flower and to dress for a trip to the movies together in a color that represented that flower. Now, that was just one example, and I wrote to my grandparents, I couldn't see the point of this. It didn't seem to be in any way helping my education. And I begged them to consider having me transferred to a state teachers college in New York State, where the tuition was low and where I could just study to be a teacher, because that's what I wanted to do. My parents saw the wisdom of that, but my grandmother clung to the dream of my social ascension. So meanwhile, I had discovered the social aspect of life that included college boys, whom we called men. My boyfriend was the pianist and leader of a dance band called the Men of Note. Each of the four musicians were talented and were good students, and the 8 of us had great times together. But in my junior year, my boyfriend and I decided to leave school at Christmas recess, marry, and move to my hometown of Ithaca. Again, exercising this unbridled freedom that I had come to recognize as my lot in life. So he quickly found a job in his chosen field. He hated college. And he became a radio announcer. And I quickly became pregnant. His family was openly hostile. My family offered us a home with my grandparents and encouragement to transfer to Cornell. So I'm going to leave that part of my life there. And if you ever want to hear about it, I can do it another time. But I'm going to skip now to the birth of my third child, which was in 1964. And my daughter April's birth was life-changing for me and introduced me to a whole new concept of how the transition of a child is forever life-changing. And to ask the question, is there a way to honor that drastic change? 2 days before my 27th birthday in 1964, my daughter April Elizabeth was due to enter the world. She was full term, and the nurses at the hospital assured me that her heartbeat was strong. And so under light anesthesia, I waited to hear her cry, but no cry or sound came. Her brother and sister waited at home to meet her. I waited to welcome her and hold her in my arms, but none of that would happen. And no one knew why. And I was sure that if I cried, I would never be able to stop. It was not until 1976 that a healing experience unexpectedly came. And this is another one of those astral travel or out-of-body experiences that had been so helpful to me in my life. In 1976, I was at a quiet outdoor place where I would meet with others in the healthcare ministry. And I had by then celebrated the Vatican II Council's radical advances in the Catholic Church by completing a master's degree in theology and by training in clinical pastoral education at Mass General in Boston. I went there with my 4 children. I was spending a lot of time as part of the Catholic Worker Farm in Tivoli, New York, and at the Catholic Worker House of Hospitality in New York City. And so Dorothy Day had become a friend, and she had asked a friend to announce from the pulpit in Massachusetts that I was seeking hospitality for myself and my 4 children while I went to this course. As a side note, I was the first lay woman selected for that program who was Catholic at Mass General. Other Catholic attendees in the past had been nuns, priests, and seminarians. Now back to the healing in the peaceful woods. I was walking in the woods and sat down to rest and enjoy the beauty of it. And suddenly I was no longer aware of being in the woods. I was literally in my mind in a hospital having my baby, my little April. There was no anesthesia needed. I heard her cry and she was placed in my arms. I looked at the doctor with gratitude. His surgical mask came off and I saw him clearly, and it was Jesus smiling at me and at my baby. I said to him delightedly, "She's alive." And he replied with such strength and kindness, "Yes, April is alive in me, and so are you, Barbara. It's a permanent condition." The scene then shifted to my own birth, and my mother was cared for by the same doctor. It was just so real. It was absolutely real. My actual birth had been complicated. My mother had polio as a child, and her pelvic structure had been affected. So the birth was very difficult and painful. It went on for more than a day or 2. I was delivered by high forceps delivery. But this time there was no pain, no trauma. It was an easy, natural birth, and I was literally reborn. And the feeling and the truth of that has never left me. So, do I have time to tell one more experience? I was invited later to be a chaplain at Cornell University and at Ithaca College in the Catholic ministries. It also involved work in jails and prisons with young people, with which I had experience. So I would preach in rotation with the priests on weekends and also lead student groups to Haiti and Guatemala occasionally, once a year. One afternoon, I attended a gathering at Cornell, which one of the priests had asked all of us to attend. He asked us to close our eyes and picture a peaceful scene for a silent meditation. Immediately there popped into my mind a picture of walking with Jesus along a lonely beach lined with palm trees. It was beautiful. And it didn't seem lonely at all. It seemed just full of life. So suddenly, as we walked and talked, we paused for a minute, and I thought he was going on ahead of me and leaving. And I said, "Please don't leave." And he answered with a smile and a chuckle, "I'm not leaving. I thought you'd come with me." Again, so real, not a temporary situation, but an invitation for life. So I've continued as a hospital volunteer and a hospice chaplain, and well, not even a chaplain, just a volunteer. And about 5 years ago, I had an opportunity to study soul realignment, which included the component of accessing the Akashic Records. So I invite you to take a look at my website for a more complete description of the work. And I've taken many classes and I've been evaluated and certified in this work. And I found that it's so empowering to me and to those who choose to have readings. So in 2021, many of us seek answers from experts, and the soul realignment modality provides not a way to get an answer from an expert, but a way to find answers within oneself and to open oneself to the realization that by clearing past blocks and restrictions, we activate our ability to become the powerful creators of our own positive experiences.
Barbara, can you tell us a little bit more about what the Akashic Records are? There are maybe some people in our audience who don't know what they are, and what do you mean by reading them?
By readings, okay, fine. I have in conclusion to my talk, look into the vortex, see the swirling images, go deeper into the swirl, spin and dream. Dream of being catapulted into a sea of mist and walk along. Push vines aside energetically, but no pressure here for arms or legs or planning. Just imagine. See shapes materialize, press on. The shapes move forward and unfold. They are fragile as gossamer, and they are strong as quartzite. They shimmer and gleam in the light. I draw nearer and feel embraced, welcomed, and restored. Am I home now? You were always home, they say. They lift me slightly. Is this flying? Not flying, just moving on. An air current gently lifts. And here I want to be, and I long to stay, enveloped in love and holiness and total fulfillment. But not yet. There's much more to come.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Barbara. Can we go back to Karen's question about the Akashic Records and how can we access them?
This is a study, a revelation of, in the Akashic Records, of course, we have all of the actions and the choices that people have made all through time. And we choose actions, we take action, and we have consequences. And sometimes the consequences are not what we would have hoped. So we're not doomed. We can choose again. And the Akashic Record shows a record of these choices that we've made, the actions we've taken, and the consequences of those actions. And if there is something that is especially troubling, that we keep repeating time after time, trying the same thing and hoping it'll get better in a new lifetime or in this life, we can clear blocks and restrictions from that, and we can choose again. And there's no limit. So there's no limit to how wonderful we can be in our life or how much we can enjoy it. We know that there are going to be roadblocks. There are going to be times when things are difficult. And in those times, we choose again. We choose a path to follow. But there's no time at which it's a final judgment, in other words. We can always choose again. We can always. So in the Akashic Record reading, I look at the way that we were, at how we were when we were created. What our strengths are. What are our energetic resources that we already have? What are the places in which we excel just naturally? Sometimes we try as a child to be like somebody else and to do what an adult tells us is a good thing to do. And we go away from our natural tendencies and natural inclinations to excel in the energy centers that we are born with. And so I bring into your vision the energy centers with which you were born. I access the Akashic Records. I get pretty straightforward information. It's not like a mediumship reading. It's not like a psychic reading. It's pretty factual. And these are my strengths. And I can choose to work within those, or I can choose to not. I can have a more difficult life if I want it, if I don't mind, by just doing things at random. Or I can think about it and make an actual choice. And sometimes the things we wish we were are not actually our gifts. But there's no reason not to pursue them. I gave a reading the other day to someone who wanted to do some writing, but that isn't his energy center. But he's going to be fine at writing because that's what he wants to do, and he can excel at it. It's not a problem. So there's no limit, but there are suggestions of what our strengths are.
This is what really confuses me. How is reading the records different to mediumship or psychic reading?
Okay, in mediumship reading, I intuitively think about reaching the person, the child, or whoever it is. I reach them through various gifts of what they call clairvoyance and all these other things where you tune into the person.
Mm-hmm.
In the Akashic Record reading, I formulate it ahead of time. I ask permission from the person for whom I'm reading to access the Akashic Record, but not to change anything, not to do anything, not to disrupt anything when I look at it. I just want the facts of their life, of the past. If they have something they've done in the past that they keep repeating because it was a choice and they keep hoping to do better. If they were, for instance, if they pledged to take care of someone for their whole life and that person died and they felt like it was their fault, and now in every lifetime they look for someone to take care of who's ill or who's suffering, and they go into it with the idea of obligation rather than with serving, then those blocks and restrictions in the past can be cleared, and they can more or less start a new way of choosing in that area. It doesn't take away anything from what you've achieved or from what you can achieve in the future. It just gives you a little bit of a picture